The security team was frantic. "Mr. President, please reconsider. This could destroy everything we've built." Ibrahim Traoré looked at his advisors, then at the handwritten speech on his desk. In just 10 minutes, he was scheduled to address the UN Emergency Summit, where the Secretary General and representatives from 192 countries waited. The safe approach would be to read the diplomatic pleasantries his team had prepared. Instead, Traoré folded the official speech and placed it in his pocket. "Today," he said quietly, "I will speak the truth that Africa has been silent about for too long." Foreign Minister Ouedraogo pressed his hands against the table, concern etched across his face. "Mr. President, if you speak about these documents, we're not just risking ourselves. The Western powers will never accept this. What we need now are more allies, not more enemies." "And who are our allies, Minister Ouedraogo?" Traoré asked, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "Those who exploit our country, steal our resources, and then claim they're coming to save us? When you brought these documents to me, what did you feel?" The room fell silent. 3 days ago, a leak had reached the Foreign Ministry, a secret agreement prepared by the United Nations under the guise of aid to Africa. This agreement stipulated that sub-Saharan African countries would transfer their most valuable mineral reserves and agricultural lands to multinational corporations in exchange for financing for so-called climate change measures. Today, UN Secretary General Alessandro Vidal would announce this plan to the world as the Africa Renaissance Initiative. "I ask you one last time," said Ouedraogo, his voice tense with uncertainty. "If you choose this path, will Burkina Faso be able to bear the consequences?" Traoré walked to the window where Geneva's elegant street stretched below. This wasn't his world. Here, everyone was too well dressed, too well fed, too far removed from the realities of life. "Do you remember?" said Traoré, still looking. "Outside, when we visited Tambao village last year, almost all the children had died from the drought. And do you remember what an old woman told us?" Ouedraogo bowed his head. "I remember, Mr. President. While we die of hunger, the mining companies use our water," she said. Traoré slowly turned back to his team. "Today I will speak for that woman, for all the mothers in Tambao, for the fathers who lost their children to starvation. And yes, this may bring us enemies, but what has silence brought us?" Security team leader Ouedraogo interjected. "Mr. President, at least allow us to double your protection detail. The reaction after your speech could be severe." Traoré shook his head. "No, Captain. I refuse to arrive with an army of protectors and pretend I'm not afraid of security. If I'm going to speak the truth, I must do it fearlessly." Just then, a UN protocol officer knocked on the door. "Mr. President, you're expected on stage in 5 minutes." Traoré took a deep breath, buttoned his jacket. "I'm ready," he told his team. "Whatever happens, history will know we stood for something today." The atmosphere in the United Nations General Assembly typically hangs heavy with diplomatic courtesy, but today's emergency summit on climate change and migration had charged the air with something close to electricity. Reports from Africa's Sahel region were devastating. Drought, famine, and subsequent political instability had displaced millions. When UN Secretary General Alessandro Vidal took the podium, the hall filled with applause. The Italian diplomat, in his 60s with silver hair, was always impeccably dressed. He had been Secretary General for 4 years, and many considered him the most charismatic leader the United Nations had seen in recent years. "Distinguished delegates," Vidal began, with a sweeping gaze across the hall, "we gather here today to confront one of the most challenging crises in human history. The situation in the Sahel is not merely a regional crisis, it is a crisis of humanity." During his speech, dramatic images from sub-Saharan Africa played on screens. Dried-up rivers, starving children, abandoned villages. "And that is why," Vidal continued, "I am proud to launch today the Africa Renaissance Initiative, the most comprehensive aid package ever seen. This plan will provide $150 billion worth of financial assistance, technical support, and infrastructure development to the most affected countries." Approving murmurs rose among the delegates. It was indeed a striking figure. Of course, said Vidal, support at this level requires certain structural adjustments to ensure responsible use of resources. The agreements in the package will allow African countries to open up their unused resources to the international market, ensuring these resources are utilized to support global sustainability goals. Most delegates in the hall didn't fully grasp what these words meant, but Ibrahim Traoré did. He had seen the documents. Unused resources and structural adjustments meant Burkina Faso and many other African countries would be surrendering their mining rights and agricultural lands. In return, money given as debt would bind these countries to international financial institutions for decades. And now, said Vidal, as we celebrate this historic initiative in the General Assembly, I would like to invite some leaders from the affected countries to the podium. First, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. Applause rose. Vidal stepped back from the podium with a gracious smile to make room for Traoré. The two leaders shook hands, a friendly acknowledgement from the Secretary General. Traoré took his place behind the podium, surveying the hall. No one in the General Assembly, except perhaps his own team, knew what he was about to say. The official speech in his pocket was a series of polite sentences praising Vidal's initiative and expressing gratitude on behalf of Africa. Instead, Traoré quietly pulled another paper from his inner pocket, a copy of the leaked documents. Mr. Secretary General, he began, his voice calm and controlled. Distinguished delegates, we gather here today to discuss the crisis facing Africa. But I say Africa does not have a single crisis. It has two. Confused glances circulated around the hall. This was not the tone of the expected grateful acceptance. The first crisis is natural: climate change, drought, agricultural challenges. In this crisis, we welcome the support of the international community. We are here to work together. But the second crisis is man-made, and I must name it clearly here today. This is neo-colonialism. A collective intake of breath filled the hall. A slight discomfort appeared on Secretary General Vidal's face. 3 days ago, Traoré continued, holding up the paper, a very interesting document reached my office. It contains the full details of the Africa Renaissance Initiative being presented to us today, the $150 billion aid package that the Secretary General just described. But this document also contains details not being shared with the public. Vidal took a step toward Traoré, attempting to intervene, but the Burkina Faso leader continued speaking. According to these documents, to receive aid, African nations must surrender their unused resources to designated multinational corporations. What are these resources? Gold, uranium, lithium, cobalt. Everything Africa has that's needed for future technologies. Vidal approached again, this time trying to cut Traoré's microphone, but Traoré didn't back down. Mr. Secretary General, he said, looking directly at Vidal, if I'm saying anything incorrect, please correct me. Are the details in this document not accurate? The hall fell into icy silence. Vidal appeared frozen for a moment, then assumed a professional smile. Mr. President, he said, technical details are always complex. Perhaps we could discuss this sensitive matter privately. No, said Traoré. We're here precisely because of deals made behind closed doors. Africa's problems must be discussed publicly. Traoré turned back to the hall. Distinguished delegates, I am not against aid. Burkina Faso and all of Africa need support. But this support must be based on partnership, not exploitation. A plan to lend us money and then take our resources is just another way of saying colonization. As Traoré continued his speech, the atmosphere in the hall grew increasingly tense. While some Western delegates whispered angrily, many delegates from African, Asian, and Latin American countries nodded in agreement. And therefore, said Traoré, I announce today that Burkina Faso will not participate in the Africa Renaissance Initiative under current terms. Instead, I call on all African nations to work together to shape our own future. What we need is not more debt, but fairer trade conditions, technology transfer, and the right to invest in our people's skills. As his speech concluded, the hall erupted with mixed reactions. Some delegates stood up applauding while others objected angrily. Secretary General Vidal quickly intervened, trying to restore order. "Distinguished delegates, please remain calm," he said. "We will have other opportunities to discuss these complex issues. Now let us continue with our program." But the hall was no longer under control. Images reflecting on cameras were broadcasting live worldwide. As Ibrahim Traoré left the podium, he saw his team rushing to meet him. "Mr. President," said Foreign Minister Ouedraogo, his face worried. "What happens now?" Traoré smiled calmly. Now real diplomacy begins." Just hours after his speech at the United Nations General Assembly, Ibrahim Traoré's words began to echo worldwide. On social media, hashtags like Africa's Truth and Fairtrade Now went viral. International news channels carried the Burkina Faso leader's bold stance in their headlines. While Secretary General Vidal and UN staff tried to contain the damage, Traoré and his team discussed their strategy in a small Geneva hotel. The room had been swept for security, checked for microphones and listening devices. "The media reaction is surprising," said Marie, Traoré's communications director, showing him the news flowing on her tablet. "Western media is calling us irresponsible and disruptive, but outlets in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are finding your speech heroic." "It's not people who are uncomfortable, just the established systems," said Traoré, looking out the hotel window. "But we can't go back now. We either move forward or perish here." At that moment, their phone rang. Marie looked at the screen, surprise crossing her face. "Mr. President, Secretary General Vidal is requesting a private meeting in 10 minutes. Tense. Glances were exchanged among those present. Such a meeting after an open confrontation was unusual. "Accept it," said Traoré. "But I won't meet alone. Minister Ouedraogo will accompany me." Precisely 10 minutes later, Alessandro Vidal entered the room. In place of his usual charismatic appearance was now a tired, almost elderly man. "Mr. President," he said, extending his hand. "After what happened today, I wanted to speak with you privately." Traoré shook his hand but maintained a cautious expression. "Please, Mr. Secretary General." Vidal sat in the chair offered to him, appearing to gather his thoughts for a moment. "First," he began, "I must say I'm hurt by your speech. We've been working on the Africa Renaissance Initiative for months. This was a well-intentioned plan designed to genuinely help Africa." "Well-intentioned?" asked Traoré. "The documents say we must surrender control of secret mines." Vidal sighed. "Politics is complex, Mr. President. Western powers want to pay for aid, but taxpayers want to see something in return. The deal wasn't perfect, but what's the alternative?" "Receiving. No aid at all?" Traoré leaned forward, his eyes blazing with determination. "If you want to help us, Mr. Secretary General, then give us fair trade conditions. Pay fair prices for our raw materials. Transfer technology instead of lending money. Don't give us fish. Let's learn to fish together." Vidal remained silent for a long time, then did something unexpected. He smiled. "You know," he said, "there was a time when I was very much like you. Long ago, I too wanted to change the system." "And what happened?" asked Traoré. "The system changed me," said Vidal, with a bitter smile. "Gradually, compromise upon compromise, until one day I found myself advocating for the very things I once opposed." Vidal stood up, walking to the window. "Perhaps what we really needed today was a shock like the one you delivered, Mr. President. You ruined my plan, yes. But maybe this plan deserved to be ruined." Traoré was surprised. This was not the conversation he had expected. "So what are you suggesting?" "Let's start again," said Vidal. "Bring African countries to the table as true partners. Open, transparent conditions. No secret clauses. And maybe, just maybe, we can create real change." Traoré nodded cautiously. "This sounds good, Mr. Secretary General. But how will you prove your good intentions?" Vidal thought for a moment. "In 2 days, I will announce the outcomes of this summit. All I ask is that you refrain from making additional statements during this time. Trust me, I won't disappoint you." The two shook hands silently, and Vidal left the room. "Do you trust him?" asked Minister Ouedraogo after the door closed. "No," said Traoré, "but I'll give him a chance. And if he doesn't keep his word, we'll come back stronger." 2 days later, at the closing session of the UN Emergency Summit, Alessandro Vidal took the podium. There was an atmosphere of tense expectation in the hall. "Distinguished delegates," he began. "In the last 48 hours, I've experienced some of the most challenging and enlightening moments of my career." President Ibrahim Traoré's bold words served as an important reminder to us all. True, aid must be based on respect and equality. Surprised whispers circulated in the hall. Therefore, I am withdrawing the Africa Renaissance Initiative and proposing instead the Africa World Equality Pact. This new approach will be based on 3 fundamental principles. First, all agreements will be completely transparent and publicly disclosed. Second, no country will be forced to surrender control of its natural resources. And third, we will focus on trade and technology transfer rather than aid. As Vidal continued speaking, Ibrahim Traoré listened carefully. The Secretary General had kept his word. He had even exceeded expectations. At the end of his speech, Vidal turned directly to Traoré. "President Traoré," he said, "your courage and honesty have inspired us all. I invite Burkina Faso to be the first signatory of the new pact." All eyes turned to Ibrahim Traoré. The Burkina Faso leader slowly stood up and walked toward the podium. As he shook hands with Vidal, the hall filled with applause. "Mr. Secretary General," Traoré said into the microphone, "I gladly accept your invitation. This could be a new beginning for Africa and the world." That evening, before leaving Geneva, as Traoré looked at the city from the hotel balcony, Marie joined him. "Congratulations, Mr. President," she said with a smile. "Your brave step has initiated real change." Traoré nodded with a thoughtful expression. "This is just the beginning, Marie. The real struggle starts now. We need to make sure words turn into actions. So what do we do next?" "We go home," said Traoré, "and show our people what we can change with their power." A few weeks later, Ibrahim Traoré returned to Tambao village, one of the villages most affected by climate change. This time he was accompanied by an international delegation, UN officials, aid organizations, and even representatives from several major corporations. When they arrived at the village, the elderly woman Fatima greeted them, the woman who had told Traoré a year ago, "While we die of hunger, mining companies use our water." "Mr. President," she said with a broad smile, "you kept your word." "I kept my word, Mother Fatima," said Traoré. "And today I've brought special guests to you." He introduced the delegation and began explaining the village's problems: dried up water wells, infertile lands, collapsed houses. But this time, solutions to these problems were also presented. Under the UN's new Africa World Equality Pact, sustainable development projects would be launched for Tambao and similar villages. "These projects," said Traoré, "won't be external aid but opportunities to develop our people's skills. Sustainable agriculture, solar energy, water harvesting, we'll do these ourselves. But this time, we'll have access to the necessary knowledge and technology." Throughout the delegation, the international representatives appeared deeply moved. At the end of the visit, the CEO of a French company approached Traoré. "Mr. President," he said, "my company usually only acts as a consultant in such projects, but what I've seen here has deeply affected me. We want to be your partner too. A real partner." "What kind of partnership do you have in mind?" asked Traoré. "We want to share our solar energy technology," said the CEO. "But more importantly, we want to train young Burkinabe to produce and maintain this technology. Not aid, but a real transfer of knowledge." Traoré smiled and extended his hand. "This is exactly the kind of collaboration we envisioned." As months passed, the relationship between Burkina Faso and other African countries with the international community began to slowly change. The Africa World Equality Pact became a real movement. Transparency, mutual respect, and partnership became the foundations of the new relationship. Tambao village changed too. Water wells were reopened, solar panels were installed, a school was built for the children. More importantly, the villagers now believed they could shape their own future. 1 year later, Ibrahim Traoré was invited to speak at the UN General Assembly again. This time, when he took the podium, a respectful silence filled the hall. "A year ago," he began, "I stood here and questioned a system. Today I'm here to report that we've begun building a new system. Africa is no longer just a continent receiving aid. It's taking its place at the table as a partner in knowledge, technology, and justice." When his speech ended, the hall gave him a standing ovation. Alessandro Vidal approached the podium with a smile and shook Traoré's hand. "You showed us the power of courage and honesty," said the Secretary General. "You've made history." As Traoré left the podium, he knew this was only the beginning. The real work of transformation was just starting. But for the first time in generations, it would be shaped by African voices, African values, and African dreams. In a small ceremony back in Tambao village the following month, a new water irrigation system was being inaugurated. As the crystal-clear water flowed for the first time, Fatima approached Traoré with tears in her eyes. "You know what this means, Mr. President?" she asked. "It means our children have a future. And it all began because you chose to speak the truth that day." Traoré nodded, deeply moved. "The truth was always there, Mother Fatima. It just needed someone to speak it." As the sun set over Tambao, casting long shadows across the newly fertile fields, the village children played around the new water system, their laughter echoing across the land that was once dying but now coming back to life. For Traoré, this sound, the laughter of children with a future, was worth more than all the diplomatic victories in Geneva. This, he thought to himself, watching the children play, is what leadership truly means. Not speeches or agreements, but lives transformed. A passing journalist observing the scene wrote in his notebook, "Today in Burkina Faso, I witnessed what happens when a leader speaks truth to power. It doesn't just change politics, it changes lives."